My name is Victoria Hale. I am 64 years old, a retired school teacher, and a widow for more than a decade. For most of my life, I poured myself into two things: my family and the hundreds of children I taught to read, to count, and to believe that kindness mattered. I never became wealthy, never traveled the world, never lived in a grand estate. But I had a good marriage until cancer took my husband, Richard, and I had a daughter, Clara, who was the pride of my days. I built my life around small acts that rarely made the newspapers, but they made me who I am. 2 weeks ago, I sat in my kitchen holding a cup of tea in my hands when my daughter's fiancé, Andrew Whitmore, called me. He was polite in tone, but the words that spilled from his mouth cut deeper than he knew. He said, "Only important people should be at our $100,000 wedding." He meant that my friends, my neighbors, and the colleagues who had stood by me through decades of teaching did not belong. He was drawing a circle of worth, and I was placed outside it. I ended the call in silence. I did not defend myself. I did not beg for respect. I simply placed the phone on the table beside my teacup, and I listened to the ticking of the old kitchen clock. In that silence, something shifted. He thought I would stay quiet forever, that my silence was weakness. But silence can be sharper than any blade when used at the right moment. That night, I opened my worn address book, the one Richard and I had kept through years of PTA meetings, school fundraisers, and construction projects he once managed. Names and numbers that had gathered dust suddenly came alive. I made a few quiet phone calls. By the time the sun rose, 11 wedding venues that Andrew and Clara had reserved were gone. Contracts were canceled, deposits refunded, calendars cleared. From the country club by the Hudson to the ballroom in White Plains, each place found a reason why the Whitmore wedding could not be held there. It was not anger that guided my hand, but memory. Every call I made reached someone who remembered a moment. How Richard had stayed late to repair a collapsed wall at the church. How I had helped a student through grief when her father died. How we had lent a hand when no one else showed up. Andrew had told me that only important people should attend. What he did not understand was that importance is not measured by money or old family names. It is measured by loyalty, by decency, by the lives you have touched when no one was watching. I wish I could say his words rolled off me, that I had grown immune to being dismissed, but the truth is, they hurt. They hurt because I have spent a lifetime giving, and in one sentence, he reduced it all to nothing. My daughter, Clara, heard those words too, though she tried to smooth them over, her eyes darting away, her hands twisting nervously. She wanted to believe love was enough, that Andrew's family name would open doors for her. She did not see the cost yet, but I saw it, as clearly as I saw the steam curling from my tea. I stared at the album on my table. The photographs inside told the story of my family: Clara's graduation cap, Richard's broad smile at our modest anniversary dinner, my own parents on the porch of their farmhouse. None of them would have passed Andrew's test of importance. And yet they were the people who built me, who built Clara, who built the very ground she was standing on when she said yes to his proposal. So I sat there, hands resting on that album, and I thought, if Andrew wants a wedding of only important people, then let him find out who really counts. He imagines power flows only through money and old reputation, but I know power flows quietly, through years of teaching, through favors done without expectation, through trust earned the hard way. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam a door. I simply made calls, one after another, to people who owed me nothing but remembered everything. By morning, 11 venues were gone. Andrew's perfect stage for his perfect wedding had vanished before his eyes. And here is where I begin my story. Because this is not a tale about destroying a wedding. It is about the quiet weight of a woman who was told she was no longer important, and how the truth proved otherwise. You may wonder if I was cruel. You may wonder if I endangered my daughter's happiness. I will tell you honestly, I wondered too. But when a man tells a mother she is not important, he is not only insulting her, he is teaching her daughter that the same judgment awaits her. This story is not about revenge. It is about remembering. It is about justice that speaks softly but carries consequences, and it begins with a cup of tea, a cruel sentence, and 11 locations gone by morning. After that phone call, after the silence and the quiet storm inside me, I found myself looking around my own house as if through someone else's eyes. My name is Victoria Hale, and I have lived in the same modest home on the edge of Westchester for nearly 40 years. This house is not large or glamorous. It has 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a front porch that creaks when you step onto it. The siding could use fresh paint, and the roses out front bloom unevenly these days because my knees will not let me tend to them as I once did. But it has always been home. It has held laughter, arguments, tears, and the long stretch of ordinary days that shape a life. For most of my years, I was a teacher. I stood in front of classrooms filled with squirming children who sometimes believed in themselves and sometimes did not. I taught them letters and numbers, but I also taught them patience, respect, and how to sit quietly long enough to hear their own thoughts. I was proud of that. Yet when Richard's health began to fail, I set aside any ambitions of moving into administration or pursuing further studies. I came home every night to care for him, and when he died, I did not return to the classroom. The truth is, I poured every bit of myself into others, and I never complained. That was how I was raised. Now, though, retirement feels like invisibility. Neighbors move in and out so quickly that I do not know their names, and they do not remember mine. They nod politely when they see me on the porch, but their eyes slide away. I am part of the scenery, like the mailboxes or the cracked sidewalk. I used to be invited to barbecues, to PTA fundraisers, to baby showers. These days, I hear music and laughter drifting from backyards, and I am not asked to join. Perhaps they assume I am too old, or too tired, or simply uninterested. But the truth is, no one asks. Even my daughter Clara comes less often than she once did. She works long hours, chasing promotions and recognition in her firm. And when Andrew entered her life, her weekends filled with his family's dinners and parties. I understand. I tell myself it is natural for a daughter to move toward her own future. Still, the silence of this house grows heavier with each season. Sometimes weeks pass without her stepping inside, and when she finally does, she is distracted, her phone buzzing with messages, her eyes glancing at the clock. She means no harm, but absence still stings, no matter how gently it arrives. There are objects in this house that hold me together. On the wooden table in the kitchen sits a porcelain teacup, its rim chipped from years of use. It belonged to my mother before me, and I reach for it every morning. The tea is rarely fancy, just black leaves with a touch of milk, but the cup itself is a ritual, an anchor. Next to it lies a thick album of photographs. The leather cover is worn soft from my hands, the corners frayed. Inside are snapshots of Clara with missing teeth, Richard at the grill on summer evenings, my classroom filled with bright faces. Every time I open it, I travel through the years. These 2 items, the teacup and the album, remind me that my life has mattered, even if the world no longer notices. When Andrew spoke of important people, I thought of these objects. To him, importance meant wealth, Pedigree, polished clothes, last names that opened doors. To me, importance was different. It was in the memory of a student who wrote me a letter 10 years after graduation, saying I was the first adult who told him he was worth something. It was in the way Richard smiled at me, even in pain, grateful that I never left his side. It was in Clara's laughter as a little girl when she climbed into my lap and begged me to read the same story again and again. These moments are hidden inside porcelain cracks and faded photographs. They do not make headlines, but they build a soul. Sometimes, late at night, I sit at that table with the teacup in one hand and the album open before me, and I wonder if I have already given my best years away. I wonder if, in the eyes of people like Andrew, I am nothing more than a woman who grew old quietly, who is no longer relevant. That thought can pierce me like a thorn. Yet another part of me knows that silence does not equal absence, and invisibility does not equal emptiness. I am still here. My memory is sharp. My heart, though bruised, still beats steady. What Andrew will never understand is that women like me do not disappear. We watch, we listen, and when the time comes, we act. My invisibility is only a mask that lets me move unseen. While others dismiss me as unimportant, I carry decades of relationships and stories stitched into every page of that album. And as I sat there, in the quiet of my kitchen, surrounded by shadows of my past, I began to realize that being invisible might just be my greatest strength. Because when the world underestimates you, it never sees you coming. I turned the album and found Richard in a hard hat, smiling into wind that lifted dust from a half-built foundation. He looked steady, the kind of man who made a promise and then set beams beneath it until the promise could bear weight. To most people, he was a contractor with a small firm. To our town, he was the reason rain stayed outside classrooms, and ramps met thresholds without a rise. Richard ran Hale Construction for 25 years. He started with a second-hand pickup, 3 men from church, and the willingness to answer his phone at 2 a.m. He fixed civic roofs and sanctuary leaks, built additions, and helped schools finish long-delayed locker rooms. He believed budgets were real and shortcuts were expensive later. After storms, he drove the route before breakfast to see what needed repair. When his diagnosis came, chemo filled our calendar. He kept working as long as he could. That meant I learned to sit where he once sat. I read blueprints like a new language. Lines became corridors. I ordered materials, reconciled invoices, and brought coffee to job sites at dawn. I kept the crews moving and the ledger honest. I did not raise my voice. I learned what Richard knew. Power lives in showing up without cameras and fixing what no one will ever credit you for. A crane operator warned me about thinned sealant. A city inspector flagged a vote that might shift. A hotel manager called late on Friday because a ceiling was sweating before a Saturday wedding. We drove over with fans, tarps, and a promise that no one would see a drip. When Richard died, the office sounded like a machine that had lost a gear. I kept a small stake in the company, not for income, but because my name on those papers felt like a thread binding me to who we had been. Leadership respected that thread. They sent updates, asked advice when a school board needed phasing, invited me to the ribbon cutting when the community center finally opened. I stayed quiet, but I stayed present. I wrote thank you notes by hand. I brought cookies to the permit office before storms. I kept phone numbers in an address book under first names and reasons to call. Margaret Liu, now an events director, saved a note from the year she learned English in my classroom. Daniel Price remembers when our crew ran heaters through a blizzard to thaw sprinkler lines for a banquet that could not be postponed. None of this lives on social media. It lives in the ledger people keep in their chests. Andrew does not know that ledger exists. He sees my chipped teacup and assumes I am a relic who should smile and step back from the seating chart. He sees a retired teacher and forgets that retired does not mean removed. He believes importance is inherited. In my world, importance is earned one midnight call and one solved problem at a time. I do not resent where he comes from. I resent what he refuses to see. There is a difference between polish and integrity. Richard taught apprentices to set rebar. Once it is tied, everything holds. The equity I kept is not only financial, it is social capital held in trust. It reaches from pews to playgrounds and from boardrooms to backlots. When I ask for something, people weigh it against years of kept promises and say yes. So when Andrew dismissed my friends and trimmed my guest list to people who mattered to him, he stepped onto a floor he could not see. He assumed the room would bear his weight because it always had. He did not know that beneath the polished wood sat joists Richard had set, checked, and replaced when they weakened. He did not know that I know where those joists run. Sometimes I stand in the laundry room and touch Richard's hard hat. The plastic is scuffed. The brim carries a small nick from a gate. It smells rain. During our wedding week, we wrote a simple creed on a torn envelope. Build what lasts. Pay what you owe. Leave places better than you found them. I keep that envelope in the album beside Clara's kindergarten photo and a receipt from our first crane rental. He does not know that my quiet is not surrender. It is the hum a building makes when the wind rises, the sound of a frame doing its job. He will learn that soon enough. For now, I turn the page, sip my tea, and carry Richard's steadiness into the days ahead, where a sentence about important people will collide with the network of lives that taught me what importance truly means. I remember the evening Clara first brought Andrew to my house. It was autumn, the kind of night when the air carries both warmth and chill, when you open a window and let the smell of leaves slip through. I had set the table in the kitchen, as I always did, with the same porcelain plates we had used for decades, and the chipped tea set my mother left me. The chairs wobbled slightly on the uneven floorboards, and the light from the overhead lamp turned golden as the sun sank behind the maples. To me, it was comfort. To Andrew, I could see, it was smallness. Clara had warned me he came from a very established family, as she put it, but she promised he was kind. She wanted me to like him. She wanted everything to feel easy. I had roasted a chicken, mashed potatoes, and baked an apple pie because that was how I welcomed people into my world. Food is not only nourishment, it is memory served warm. When they arrived, Clara's cheeks glowed with excitement. She carried herself differently, almost as though she were performing. Andrew stepped through my doorway with perfect posture, his coat tailored, his shoes polished, his smile measured. He shook my hand firmly and thanked me for inviting him. His words were flawless, but his eyes roamed my kitchen the way an appraiser examines furniture. They lingered on the peeling paint near the window, the old kettle steaming on the stove, and the tea set with its hairline cracks. "Lovely little place," he said, and he let the word little fall with just enough weight that I could feel it land between us. It was not rude, not overt, but it carried a judgment all the same. Clara laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, eager to smooth the moment. She poured him water and asked if he wanted wine. I noticed she chose the newer glasses from the cabinet, not the ones we usually used. She wanted to impress him, to erase the rough edges of her home. We sat to eat. Andrew complimented the meal, but I could hear the practiced tone in his praise. His fork tapped the plate without sound, careful and controlled. He asked polite questions about my teaching career, but his eyes drifted toward Clara whenever I spoke, as if her answers mattered more. He wanted to know which university she had attended, which companies she had worked for, which contacts she had made. When I spoke of my years in the classroom, he smiled, but his gaze slid away, as though kindness and discipline were of little value in his world. The conversation circled around his family. He mentioned his father's position at the bank, his mother's charitable boards, his grandparents' estate. He used words like legacy and influence, as if these were the natural language of belonging. Clara listened intently, nodding, proud to be included in the orbit of his name. I watched her face soften every time he touched her hand, and my heart ached with both love and unease. I noticed the smallest things. When I passed him the bread, he looked at my hands, rough from years of chalk and gardening, and his eyes flickered. When I apologized for the creak of the chair he sat on, he smiled too broadly, as if tolerating inconvenience with noble grace. He never said anything unkind, but subtlety can wound just as deeply as open insult. After dinner, I brought out the apple pie. The crust was uneven, browned more on one side, but the scent filled the room. Clara closed her eyes and smiled at the familiarity. Andrew took a slice, thanked me, and then leaned toward Clara to whisper something I could not hear. She blushed and looked at the floor. In that moment, I understood. He would always make her feel as though she had to adjust, herself to fit. When they left that evening, Clara kissed my cheek and promised to call. Andrew shook my hand again, his grip firm, his eyes already turned toward the driveway. As the door closed, the house grew quiet, but the echo of his voice remained. Lovely little place. I stood in the kitchen, cleared the plates, and ran my hand over the chipped porcelain of the tea set. I thought of Richard, who never once measured my worth by the size of a room. That night, I sat with my album open on the table. I looked at photographs of birthdays and school plays, at Clara's smile when she was still a child who ran into my arms without hesitation. I asked myself if she could see what I saw, if she felt the distance in Andrew's eyes. Maybe love had blinded her, maybe ambition had whispered too loudly. I did not speak my doubts. I knew my silence, patient and steady, would keep me ready for the moment when truth revealed itself. From that first dinner, I carried a quiet certainty. Andrew was polite, educated, and handsome. But behind the polish, I felt the shadow of condescension. And while Clara thought she was walking into a brighter world, I feared she was stepping into a cage lined with velvet. Clara taught me how a person can shine and still dim herself for someone else. My daughter is 29, quick with strategy, rising in a regional marketing role where she builds campaigns that change habits. She knows how to choose a single line that moves an audience. She can hear when a comma should be a period. In conference rooms, she is confident and crisp. Yet when she stood beside Andrew Whitmore, her light narrowed into a careful beam. I watched it without spectacle, the way daylight thins when a cloud decides it owns the sky. Andrew's world carried a glow that Clara mistook for warmth. The Whitmore name opened doors with soft hinges. Invitations arrived on thick paper, embossed and heavy. Weekends took place on lawns that rolled like fabric, with stone steps that insisted you slow your walk. At the first charity gala he brought her to, she learned which fork implied that she belonged and which stories did not. She was coached to avoid details that sounded ordinary. She practiced how to say banker and senator, as if those titles were seasons everyone expected. Clara began to measure herself against the room instead of her own mirror. She replaced the canvas sneakers she loved with narrow heels that taught her feet to whisper. She traded cardigan ease for dresses that required stillness. She adjusted the pitch of her laugh to fit crystal and linen. When she told a story about a neighborhood block party, Andrew smiled and redirected the conversation to a museum opening. He did it gently, with the soft pressure of a hand on an elbow. It was a kindness that trimmed her edges. I told myself to wait, to watch, to trust that love would not ask her to shave herself down to fit. But I also kept a list in my head. She called to say she could not meet me for Saturday breakfast because his family had added a brunch that required attendance. She changed her phone wallpaper from a photograph of the two of us on the porch to a stylized shot of Andrew in a tuxedo. She checked my kitchen for light before taking a picture, then decided not to take the picture. Each moment was small. All of them together were not. She was not trying to become someone else. She was trying to become the most acceptable version of herself for their gaze. There is a difference, but it can kill the same parts. When we met for coffee near her office, she kept her phone face down and promised she was all mine for an hour. The device hummed anyway, and every hum pulled a thread from our time. She spoke about guest lists and legacy gifts, about a family friend who might advise her next move. I asked questions the way teachers do, with a hand on the question so it does not feel like a test. Did she laugh in those rooms? Did her shoulders drop? Did anyone ask her about the work she was proud of rather than the work she might be offered? She answered carefully. She said the rooms were aspirational. She said comfort would come with fluency. She said it was a season that would pass once she settled into the circle. I listened and nodded, and I tucked her words away in the ledger where a mother stores her worries. When she brought Andrew by, he sewed that circle around her without lifting a needle. The way he looked at my chipped tea set told her which part of herself to hide. He was courteous and exact. He corrected her pronunciation of a French painter in front of me, and then kissed her temple as if the kiss erased the cut. Later, she told me he was helping her grow. I placed that sentence where I keep splinters, knowing I would remove it when it festered. His family dazzled her with a practiced kindness that made room only for the version of Clara that reflected well on them. Their patriarch asked thoughtful questions about campaigns and then explained at length how legacy brands think. Their matriarch praised her poise, then offered a tailor who could refine the line of her dress. Clara took notes and thanked them. She wanted to be gracious. She wanted to be worthy of the attention. Worthy is a dangerous word when you already are. At home, I saw the adjustment in small motions. She stood straighter when she stepped through my door, as if my house graded posture. She checked the framed photos for dust. She picked up the album and closed it gently after a single page, as if lingering might smear the ink. She tucked a loose curl behind her ear and looked at me with tender urgency, asking if I was happy for her. I said yes, because I want happiness to meet my child at every corner. In my chest, I added a condition. I want happiness that does not shrink her. A mother's job changes shape, but it never retires. I remembered Clara as a girl who directed a street full of children with chalk and a whistle. I remembered the way she read poems out loud in the living room, tripping on big words and laughing at her own courage. Standing next to Andrew, she became a woman who waited for permission to fill the air. She did not see it. I did. She was learning to fold herself to fit the mold they held up to her. The fold lines were faint, but real. I kept my voice even and my presence steady. I told her no future worth living requires your shrinking. She kissed my cheek and called me sweet. She said I did not need to worry. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she needed to believe it. I made tea in the chipped cup and placed the album on the table, 2 anchors against the drift. If the world tried to make my daughter small, I would give her back her size, even if I had to stand alone to do it. The first wounds rarely bleed. They arrive quietly, disguised as suggestions, softened with smiles. That is how the trimming of my life began, on paper, with a pen, at Clara's kitchen table. She had invited me over one Saturday to finalize the guest list. I carried a folder of names I thought deserved a seat at her wedding. People who had stood by me through storms and setbacks, who had carried casseroles through my door when Richard was in the hospital, who had sat with Clara when I had parent-teacher meetings late into the night. These were not names that impressed society pages, but they were names that had built my days. Clara opened her laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in her eyes. Andrew sat beside her, scrolling through spreadsheets with the confidence of someone used to editing lives. His finger moved down the columns, pausing over certain names. He circled one with the cursor, glanced at Clara, and then at me. "Mom's friends might not fit the vibe," he said. The words were casual, as though he were choosing flowers instead of people. Clara looked at me quickly, searching for my reaction, then back at him. "Maybe we should just keep it streamlined." For balance, I sat there with my list in my lap. Names written in my careful script. Margaret from the library, who gave Clara her first job shelving books. Mr. Harris, the retired custodian who had fixed Clara's bike more than once. The Rodriguez family, who had lived next door when we had nothing but a leaky roof and a prayer. These names meant belonging. To Andrew, they meant inconvenience. "Lovely people, I'm sure," he continued, his tone gentle. "But a wedding reflects the families involved. The Palmers, the Whitmores, our circles expect a certain atmosphere." He had slipped from my daughter's fiancé into an ambassador of lineage, speaking as though he held centuries in his pocket. I heard Clara sigh. She wanted peace. She wanted to please him. I could have spoken then. I could have explained that my circle had kept me alive when nothing else could, that my so-called unpolished friends had built more character in their hands than money could buy. But I stayed, quiet. My silence was not consent. It was memory. I etched every word into the ledger I was keeping, a ledger Andrew did not know existed. Clara tapped the keyboard, deleting names. Each tap was soft but sharp to me. She did not look at me while she pressed the keys. She was trying to protect herself from the weight of my eyes. "It's nothing personal," Andrew said, as if personal dignity were not already spilling on the floor. "It's just reality." Optics matter. When people walk into a room, they notice who is sitting where, who is part of the family. You want everything to shine. That word settled in the space between us. To him, shine came from chandeliers and designer gowns. To me, shine came from loyalty, from love that did not flinch when life turned brutal. I folded my list and slipped it back into the folder. My hand moved calmly, though inside I felt something break. Not a large break, not yet. Just a small crack, the kind you find in porcelain long before the handle falls away. Clara reached for my arm as if to soften the moment. "Mom, it's just logistics. We'll celebrate with your friends another time. Maybe something more casual, like a backyard party. Everyone will still feel included." Her voice was gentle, but the suggestion was cruel in its innocence. A backyard party, as if loyalty deserved plastic plates, while prestige deserved crystal. She did not hear herself. Love had made her deaf. I nodded and said nothing. I let them continue adjusting columns and rows, assigning human worth like numbers on a budget. My eyes drifted to the window. Outside, children biked down the street, their laughter rising like bells. None of them knew yet that someday someone might weigh their importance by table placement. When the list was complete, Andrew leaned back with satisfaction. Clara looked tired, as though she had been pulled in two directions for too long. I kissed her cheek before I left and told her the meal had been lovely. She smiled with relief, mistaking my calm for agreement. That night, back at my house, I placed the folded list inside the family album. It lay there among photographs of birthdays and graduations. its deletions whispering louder than the smiles in the pictures. I touched the chipped rim of my teacup and thought, he does not see it yet, but each cut adds up. And I do not forget. Because silence remembers what pride ignores. And silence, when ready, speaks with consequences. We toured the venue on a bright Saturday that flattered marble and glass. The lobby smelled of lilies. A pianist rehearsed down the hall. Andrew moved ahead like a man who expects doors to part. Clara followed, her hand tucked into his arm. I walked a step behind. At the reception desk, a woman in a navy suit welcomed us and led us toward tall doors. "Our wedding planner will meet you in the ballroom," she said. When the doors opened, light poured across a floor that gleamed like water. The planner approached. Andrew did not wait for introductions. He gestured toward me with a half smile. "She's Clara's mom. She used to teach." The pause before the clause hung like a shrug. Used to. I felt how the words pushed 3 decades into a drawer labeled past and small. The planner looked at me, and something flickered in her eyes. "Mrs. Hale," she said, "it is good to see you." I searched her face and saw a girl from a row near the windows, hair in a barrette, eyes alert. "Margaret," I said. "Margaret Liu." Clara turned, surprised. Andrew adjusted his cufflinks. Margaret smiled. "You taught me in 4th grade," she said. "You stayed after school to help me rehearse my first presentation. I still hear you reminding me to breathe between ideas." She shook my hand, then covered it with her other hand. Andrew cleared his throat. "Let us review layout and capacity. We have concerns about optics and flow." He spoke to Margaret. "Our families are bringing guests with certain expectations. We prefer elevated finishes, controlled lighting, a seating chart that highlights key relationships." Clara nodded. Margaret opened her portfolio, but she angled it toward me first. "We can ensure the head table has sightlines for everyone who matters," she said, then glanced at me as if to say that mattering is not a synonym for money. She walked us through options, yet each time Andrew tried to glide past me, she found a way to include me. "Mrs. Hale, how does this feel from a teacher's eye?" she asked, and I answered softly about flow and how people move. Andrew approved when my comment aligned with efficiency. He ignored it when it aligned with dignity. "We will keep the floor clear," he concluded, "and reserve front tables for important guests." He did not hear Clara's intake of breath. Margaret heard it. Her eyes flashed, then settled. We stepped onto the terrace. Sun brushed the river. A breeze lifted the linens. Andrew framed the view with his hands. "Legacy," he said. "This will read as legacy." He shifted and placed me in shadow with a shoulder that blocked the light. I stepped aside and let the shadow pass. Inside, Margaret offered water. When Andrew and Clara drifted toward the bandstand, Margaret lowered her voice. "You were the first adult who told me I could lead a room," she said. "I have not forgotten." She glanced toward the couple. "If there is anything you need from me today, say it." "Today I am just the mother," I said, and felt the sentence fray as it left my mouth. Margaret handed me a card anyway. On the back, she wrote her direct number, then a quiet line. "You truly matter here." My throat tightened. I tucked the card into my purse as if it might break. We rejoined Andrew near the stage. He was debating a string quartet versus a 12-piece orchestra. He nodded toward the ceiling. "We can program the lights to feel more refined." He glanced at me, as though refinement were a language I did not speak. "We will limit speeches to keep the tone elevated." "Elevated," Margaret echoed, neutral. "Of course." She looked at me again as if placing a steadying hand on my shoulder without moving. "We can also create moments that feel human." Andrew smiled thinly. "Human is fine, so long as it remains elegant. In a room built to make everything shine, the smallness of his sentence settled over me like dust. I folded my hands to keep them still. I will not argue, I told myself. I will remember. Margaret's gaze met mine for one quiet beat, a mirror reflecting the dignity he tried to diminish. On the way out, Andrew thanked the staff and gathered brochures as if collecting evidence of status. Clara squeezed my arm and whispered, "Wasn't it beautiful?" It was. But beauty without respect is only light on glass. As the doors closed behind us, the ledger in my chest gained another line. Somewhere behind those doors stood a woman who remembered the child she had been, and the teacher who believed in her, a witness whose presence had begun to tip the room. The words came through the phone with the ease of someone who had never been corrected. Only important people should be at our $100,000 wedding. Andrew's voice carried no malice. It carried something colder, certainty. I did not answer right away. Instead, I looked at the chipped rim of my teacup, steam rising in the late afternoon light. My hand felt steady, though my chest was a storm. I placed the cup carefully on its saucer, the porcelain clicking against wood like a small gavel. That sound marked the end of something I had carried quietly for months. The sun dipped low, painting my living room in amber. Light stretched across the table, landing on the family album that never left its place. The leather cover was worn soft by years of turning. Clara's childhood face smiled from the first page. Richard's steady eyes watched from the second. The rays caught the edge of a photograph, setting it aglow, as if to remind me of the foundations we had built. Ordinary by Andrew's measure, but everything by mine. For a long moment, I just breathed. Inhale, exhale, the way I used to teach nervous children before their first recital. My silence must have unnerved him. "Did you hear me, Mrs. Hale?" He pressed, with a polite edge that dressed disrespect in fine cloth. "Yes," I said finally. My voice was calm, level, almost soft. He mistook it for agreement. He continued about guest lists, about optics, about legacy. I stopped listening. My mind had already moved elsewhere. Slowly, deliberately, I closed the album. Dust lifted into the air, spinning in the gold light. I thought of every name erased from Clara's guest list, every neighbor who had fed us when Richard's hours were cut, every friend who had stood in our driveway the morning we buried him. Not one of them mattered to Andrew, but to me, they were the pillars that had held up our lives. I traced the spine of the album with my fingers. The ridges felt like a pulse. I remembered Richard's voice, steady and low, telling me that respect is not claimed, it is recognized. He built houses that lasted because he built trust first. That trust had not vanished with him. It lived in the people whose roofs we had repaired, whose doors we had opened, whose families we had carried through storms. Andrew knew nothing of this world. He saw a retired teacher with a teacup, not a woman with a network woven through decades of work and loyalty. He assumed importance was an inheritance. He did not understand that mine was earned one promise at a time. The phone was still warm in my hand when I realized I would not be silent any longer. Not loud, not vengeful, just steady. I had tolerated the cuts, the list trimmed, the titles diminished, the subtle smiles of dismissal. But this sentence, spoken as fact, had drawn the final line. I placed the phone down beside the album. My reflection wavered in the glass of the cabinet door across the room. A woman with silver hair, lines around her eyes, and a quiet strength that had been mistaken for weakness. I saw myself fully in that moment, and I knew I had been underestimating my own place at this table. I whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear. "No more." The words settled into the air like seeds into soil, small, almost invisible, but certain to grow. The room seemed to pause with me. The ticking clock on the mantel slowed, or perhaps it was only my breathing that deepened. The world outside kept moving, cars down the street, a dog barking. But inside, something shifted. It was the stillness before action, the kind of silence that carries weight. I stood, smoothed the wrinkles from my skirt, and carried the album to the cabinet. I placed it upright, spine outward, like a witness ready to testify. Then I returned to the table, picked up the phone, and began to dial. Not angrily, not hastily, just with the clarity of someone who has remembered her own worth. The first call was to a name written long ago on Richard's notepad. Then another, and another. Each ring connected me back to the web of lives Andrew had dismissed. He thought my silence was surrender. He was about to learn it was preparation. By the time the evening shadows stretched long across the floor, I had made several quiet calls. I did not raise my voice once. I did not threaten. I simply reminded people of promises kept, of roofs sealed against rain, of favors done without asking for repayment. And one by one, doors began to close for Andrew Whitmore. The tea on the table had cooled, but I felt warm, alive in a way I had not felt in years. His words still echoed, only important people. I let them echo, because soon enough he would discover that importance does not always wear a tuxedo or hold a bank account. Sometimes it holds a teacup, sets it down, and changes the course of a wedding with nothing more than silence and a few phone calls. That was the moment I stopped enduring. That was the moment I began. The first number I dialed was written on the back of Margaret Liu's card. My finger hesitated only once before pressing the final digit. The line rang, steady and familiar, like a clock counting down to something I could not take back. Mrs. Hale? Her voice was warm, surprised, but not uncertain. I didn't expect to hear from you so soon. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself. Margaret, I said, it feels strange to call you that. I still see the little girl who stood in front of our class, shaking, whispering her report on Harriet Tubman. She laughed softly, and you stood behind me and whispered, "Breathe, just breathe." I remember. Her tone shifted, more formal. How can I help you now? The question opened a door. I stepped through carefully. It's about my daughter's wedding. The booking at the Riverlight Hotel. It belongs to the Whitmore family. But Margaret, I need you to cancel it. There was silence, the kind that weighs more than words. I imagined her frowning, biting her lip as she once did when choosing the right answer on a spelling test. That's a large event, she said finally. One of the biggest this quarter. You're asking me to... She stopped, then lowered her voice. Why, Mrs. Hale? I did not list every insult. I did not repeat Andrew's sentence about important people. Instead, I said the truth in fewer words. Because some people need to learn that money cannot erase decency, and because my daughter deserves better than a man who believes it can. Another pause, and then her voice softened. I don't need more explanation. You gave me courage when no one else did. I'll take care of it. I felt the breath I had been holding leave me slowly. Margaret, I don't want you in trouble. This is not revenge. This is a boundary. She replied firmly, sometimes boundaries need to be drawn by people who once taught us how to stand tall. I'll mark it as a family emergency. No one will question it. They'll get their deposit back, but they won't get the ballroom. The practical certainty in her words carried me back to that classroom decades ago, when she finally spoke her presentation loud enough for everyone to hear. I had smiled then, proud of her strength. Now she was giving that strength back to me. "Thank you," I whispered. My hand trembled slightly, but not from guilt, from the weight of memory pressing against the present. "You don't owe me thanks," she said. "You showed me once that my voice mattered. This is just me remembering." We ended the call with quiet goodbyes. I set the phone on the table, then rested my palms flat against the wood. The room was hushed, the kind of hush that comes after rain when the air is washed clean. I did not smile. I did not feel triumph. Instead, I leaned back and let out a long, slow sigh. The album on the cabinet caught the fading light, Richard's face half in shadow, half in glow. "There are debts," I murmured to the empty room, "that are paid not in money, but in kindness given years ago." My words settled in the air like dust motes drifting through a sunbeam. I thought of the times I had stayed after school, listening to Margaret stumble through sentences until she found her voice. I thought of the cookies she had brought me once as a child, shyly offering them in a napkin, because her mother could not afford store-bought gifts. Those moments had seemed small then. Tonight, they had grown into a fortress. Andrew would never understand this kind of currency. His accounts measured only dollars and optics. Mine measured memory, loyalty, and quiet gratitude. And in that measure, I was rich beyond anything he could tally. I poured myself another cup of tea. The steam rose, curling like the invisible ties between past and present. I held the chipped cup steady in my hands, feeling its weight. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. I simply sat in the silence and let the truth breathe. This was only the first call. Others would follow. But in that moment, what mattered was not the power of what I had done. What mattered was the reminder that seeds planted long ago, seeds of patience, kindness, and belief, had grown into trees strong enough to shield me now. I lifted the cup to my lips and whispered to Richard's photo across the room. "The frame holds, love." It still holds. After Margaret's voice faded from the line, the quiet of my living room filled again. I stared at the list of names written in Richard's old notepad. The ink had faded, but the weight of each connection remained. My hand hovered for a moment, then pressed the next number. The ring lasted only once. "Mrs. Hale?" The man's voice cracked into recognition before I could speak. Daniel Price, now director of the Westchester Convention Center, had once been a nervous apprentice learning how to check fire codes under Richard's eye. "Daniel," I said. "You don't have to explain," he cut in. "I remember when your husband fixed our roof the night before the governor's visit. You two saved my job. If you're calling, it matters. I'll cancel the Whitmore booking before sundown. No questions asked." The call ended with a promise, not paperwork. My throat tightened. I hadn't asked for loyalty. It had come unbidden, grown from years of quiet labor that Andrew would never see. I dialed again. The phone barely finished its first ring. "Victoria Hale?" Well, I'll be Bill Turner's voice carried the grit of salt air, the same grit that had once coated his hands when Richard rebuilt the Marina Pier after a hurricane. "Bill," I began, but he interrupted with a chuckle. "If you're asking whether the Whitmore reception can still happen at my harbor club, the answer's already no. The day you called me at midnight and brought coffee to my exhausted crew, I swore I'd return that favor someday. Looks like today's the day." The words landed like an anchor dropped clean into the water, firm, resolute, irreversible. One by one, I moved down the list. A banquet manager who remembered my handwritten notes of thanks. A hotel director whose daughter I had once tutored after school, free of charge, until she could read confidently. Each call began with my name, and each answer was the same. A swift agreement, a door closed with loyalty rather than locks. I barely had to explain. My voice alone carried history, a ledger of trust signed long before this evening. They didn't need contracts. They needed only to remember. As I listened to each yes, I thought of Andrew's words. Only important people. He believed importance came from titles and bloodlines. But here I was, a widow with a chipped teacup, summoning a network that bent venues and shifted timetables with nothing more than memory. Importance had answered me on the first ring. I sat straighter in my chair. The air around me changed. I was no longer the invisible woman in the corner of Andrew's polished world. I was the quiet thread woven through this community, strong enough to pull taut when tested. The power reversal was almost invisible, but I could feel it. For months, Andrew had treated me as an afterthought, someone to be tolerated, managed, pushed toward the back table. Yet tonight, with each dial tone and each quick yes, I became the axis on which his wedding would turn. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice. I simply carried on, call after call, watching the stack of names grow smaller as the circle of loyalty grew larger. The album on the cabinet seemed to glow in the fading light, Richard's eyes steady in the photograph. His work had built structures, mine had built bridges, and now those bridges were carrying me. By the time the clock struck 9, 11 venues had vanished from Andrew's reach. Each door closed quietly, politely, without drama, but together they formed a wall no money could climb. I leaned back, folded my hands in my lap, and let the silence settle. For the first time in months, I did not feel invisible. I felt present, solid, undeniable. Andrew thought he held the guest list. Tonight, he would learn whose name truly opened and closed doors. Clara called the next morning, her voice carrying the tremor of someone trying to hold two worlds together. "Mom," she said quickly, almost whispering, "something strange is happening." Andrew's furious. 3 venues called within hours to cancel. The Riverlight, the Convention Center, even the Harbor Club. They all said different things. Plumbing, scheduling conflicts, family emergencies. But it doesn't add up. He's convinced someone is sabotaging us. I listened, the receiver warm against my cheek. Her words stacked one over the other, but I heard the fear underneath. She wanted reassurance, the kind a mother gives no matter how old her child becomes. "What did he say exactly?" I asked. Clara sighed. He slammed his phone down, said this county is run by petty people who don't know how to respect old names. He called 3 lawyers before breakfast. Then he muttered something about finding out who's pulling strings. He swears someone has it out for him. I traced the rim of my teacup with one finger, the familiar chip catching my skin. The truth sat in me like a stone at the bottom of clear water. "And what do you think, Clara?" Her pause was long, fragile. "I don't know. Maybe it's coincidence. But Mom, 11 places don't cancel at once. Not unless—" She trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. "Not unless what?" I pressed gently. "Not unless someone made a call," she whispered. "Andrew thinks maybe your connections had something to do with it. He asked me outright if you've ever worked with these venues. I told him you were just a teacher, that you wouldn't have that kind of influence." Her voice cracked on just a teacher, as if 30 years of shaping minds and building quiet bridges meant less than the weight of his family crest. I swallowed hard, letting silence fill the space. Silence, I had learned, is its own language. Inside, my thoughts moved with a steady clarity. He still didn't understand. He thought in terms of sabotage, of enemies plotting. But this wasn't sabotage. It was truth, turning its back on him. The truth of favors kept, of trust earned, of lives touched in ways money could not measure. "Mom," Clara's voice pulled me back. "He's unraveling. He barely slept. He keeps pacing, muttering about optics, about how people will laugh at us if this wedding falls apart. He says it's a conspiracy." I closed my eyes. I could picture Andrew, his polished confidence cracking at the edges. He had built his identity on control, on the certainty that doors would always open. Now, for the first time, those doors were closing. Not because of sabotage, but because the foundation he stood on was hollow. "What did you say to him?" I asked. "I told him people respect him," Clara said, but the words lacked conviction. "I told him we'd find another venue. But Mom, I've never seen him like this. He looked scared. The word sat heavy. Scared men often lash out. Scared men often mistake the mirror for the enemy. "Clara," I said softly, "sometimes fear shows us who someone really is. Watch carefully." She didn't reply right away. Then, in a small voice, she asked, Did you have anything to do with this?" My breath slowed. I thought of the album glowing in the evening light, of Margaret's steady gaze, of Daniel and Bill's quick assurances. I thought of Richard, who had built not only walls, but trust. I did not answer her question directly. Instead, I offered the truth she needed. "Clara, what's happening isn't sabotage. It's consequence. When you treat people as if they don't matter, eventually they show you just how much they do." She exhaled shakily. "I don't know how to tell him that." "You don't need to," I said. "Life is telling him already." We ended the call with her voice uncertain, mine calm. I set the phone down and looked again at my chipped teacup. In its imperfection, I saw myself, dismissed by Andrew, underestimated by his world. Yet here I sat, steady, while his polished surface began to fracture. He still thought it was sabotage. He still imagined an enemy plotting against him. What he did not understand was that truth, once neglected, has its own way of rising. It does not shout. It does not strike. It simply turns, quietly, and walks away from those who never honored it. And when truth turns its back, even the grandest wedding collapses into silence. The phone rang just after dusk, its sharp tone cutting through the stillness of my house. I knew who it was before I lifted the receiver. Some voices arrive even before they speak. "Mrs. Hale," Andrew said, clipped, his polish cracking at the edges. "Did you do this?" He didn't waste time on courtesy. His tone carried the panic of a man whose world was unraveling, thread by thread. I could hear the rustle of papers in the background, the hollow echo of an expensive room that suddenly felt smaller. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let silence stretch across the line. Silence has weight. It forces the other person to feel their own words echo back at them. I could hear him breathe, faster now, as if the lack of my reply pressed harder than any denial could. "Don't play games with me," he snapped. 11 venues don't vanish overnight by coincidence. Someone is pulling strings, and every trail points back to you. "Did you sabotage this wedding?" I studied the teacup cooling beside me. Steam had long since vanished, leaving the faint trace of earlier warmth. My hand rested on the family album, its spine solid against my palm. Richard's face looked up at me from the photograph on the first page, steady as ever. I thought of all the calls I had made, not in anger, but in remembrance. Not sabotage. Memory awakened. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm, even softer than his. "Maybe," I said, pausing long enough for the word to settle. "Maybe the important people finally remembered who I am." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. I imagined him gripping the phone, struggling to process words that carried no apology, no fear. What does that mean? He demanded. Are you admitting something? Again, I let quiet answer first. Silence unsettles men like Andrew, who rely on control, on explanations that can be managed. The absence of words leaves them with only themselves. It means, I said, at last, that importance isn't defined by a headline or a family crest. It's defined by what you leave behind in people. And perhaps those people decided you weren't worth their rooms, their tables, their light. He exhaled sharply, a sound between disbelief and rage. You're trying to ruin me. To ruin Clara's future, I closed the album slowly, the sound of pages meeting one another like the closing of a door. No, I said, firm but quiet. You're doing that on your own. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The line hummed between us, alive with the weight of things unsaid. I pictured him pacing, jaw tight, hands restless. I sat still, my shoulders relaxed, the quiet filling me like breath. Finally, his voice broke through, brittle. You don't know what you're up against. I almost smiled, though he couldn't see it. Andrew, you still think this is a contest of power, but it isn't. This is the sound of truth catching up. He tried again, angrier now. You'll regret this. My family has influence you can't imagine. Perhaps, I said gently, but influence without integrity collapses faster than a roof without beams. I taught children that lesson in my classroom, long before you ever thought to lecture me about society. He sputtered, searching for words, but I gave him none to hold on to. Instead, I let silence descend again, thick and undeniable. Answer me, he barked finally, desperation bleeding through. But I had already given him all the answer he would ever get. Silence as shield, silence as mirror, silence as power. When he realized I would not speak again, the line went dead. He had hung up first, but I was the one who ended the conversation. I sat back, listening to the clock tick steadily on the mantel. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of invisibility lift. He had tried to make me small with words. I had undone him with none at all. The chipped teacup, the family album, the stillness of my living room. These were not signs of weakness. They were anchors. They were reminders. They were the quiet proof that the so-called unimportant people could carry a force that even Andrew Whitmore could not control. Silence had spoken, and he had heard it louder than anything I might have shouted. The phone rang late, when the house was already folded into quiet. I nearly let it go to voicemail, but the second ring carried something fragile, something that tugged me from my chair. When I answered, Clara's voice spilled out, broken and raw. I just want this to work, Mom, she sobbed. I just want it all to work. Her words pierced through me. I could picture her sitting on the edge of her bed, makeup smudged, dress still hanging in the closet like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. My daughter, who had always been so composed, was unraveling. Clara, I said softly, steadying my voice so hers might find an anchor. Tell me, what's in your heart, not what Andrew expects you to say. There was a pause, filled with muffled tears. He's so angry, Mom. He says people are out to humiliate him. He says if I just stand by him, if I show loyalty, we can overcome this. But I don't know anymore. I feel like I've been shrinking, like I'm not enough unless I'm part of his world. And still, he looks at me like I might not measure up. I closed my eyes, the weight of her confession settling into me. For a moment, the teacher in me wanted to correct, to guide, to point her toward the answer written so clearly between the lines. But the mother in me knew she needed to find it herself. Clara, I asked quietly, does he love you, Or does he love the doors you open for him? Her breath caught. Silence stretched, fragile as glass. I could almost hear her mind turning, replaying every moment, every smile, every gentle correction Andrew had given her, as if polishing her down to fit a mold. "Mom," she whispered finally, "I don't know. I thought he loved me. But now, when I look back, I see how often he talks about optics, about legacy, about his family name. He doesn't ask about my work, my ideas. He tells me what I should wear, who I should be around. And I let him." Her voice cracked. What if I've been confusing control with love? My hand tightened around the phone, but I kept my tone even. Love doesn't ask you to erase yourself, Clara. It doesn't require you to shrink to fit. Love makes room. It celebrates. It honors. She wept softly, the sound of a heart realizing it had been bartering pieces of itself. But I wanted it so badly, Mom. I wanted to belong, to feel like I finally fit into a world that seemed bigger than me. I looked toward the family album, still resting where I had left it. Richard's face looked back at me, calm and steady. I remembered how he had loved me, without trimming, without conditions. We built a life not on optics, but on trust. "You already belong, Clara," I said. "To me. To the people who raised you, who held you when you scraped your knees, who cheered at your graduations. You don't have to earn that belonging. It's yours." She was quiet a long while, and in that silence, I felt the weight of the question pressing on me. Should I let her decide, even if her choice wounded her deeper? Or should I stand between her and a man who mistook possession for love? The moral conflict knifed through me. A mother's instinct is to protect, but a woman's wisdom knows some lessons can't be borrowed. They have to be lived. I wanted to shield her. I also wanted to trust her strength. "Mom," she said finally, her voice fragile but clearer, "what if I've made a mistake too big to undo?" "No mistake is too big to step away from," I told her. "The only mistake is staying when you know you deserve better." Her sobs quieted. She sniffled, then whispered, "I don't know if I'm brave enough." "You are," I said firmly, though my own heart trembled. "You've always been brave. You just forgot for a while." When we hung up, the silence of the house closed in again. I set the phone down gently, but the question stayed, echoing louder than the ticking clock. Do I let her walk this path alone, or do I step in, knowing the cost of silence? I touched the album's spine, my fingers tracing the grooves worn deep by years. Somewhere between those pages lay the answer, not just for me, but for Clara. For now, all I could do was hold my breath and pray she would see herself clearly before the world convinced her to disappear. The news did not come from Andrew or Clara. It arrived the way gossip always does. Quick, sharp, carried on lips that taste a little too eager. By Tuesday afternoon, I overheard it at the market. Two women stood near the apples, whispering loud enough for half the aisle to hear. "Did you read the society column?" one asked, adjusting her sunglasses though we were indoors. "The Whitmore wedding, canceled at 3 venues in 1 week. Some are saying the bride's side isn't up to standard." The other woman gasped, her hand pausing above a bag of oranges. "Not enough class, you mean? Old money doesn't mix with, well, you know." Her eyes flicked past me, not recognizing me at all. I placed my basket down gently, took my time selecting a head of lettuce. Silence is a cloak. I wore it easily. They didn't know that the woman they were dissecting was standing 2 feet away. By evening, the whispers had grown louder. A neighbor stopped me at the mailbox, lowering her voice. "Victoria, I don't mean to pry, but people are talking. They say the Whitmores can't seem to find a venue. Some are wondering if if your side isn't a good match. She tried to soften it with a smile that never reached her eyes. I thanked her politely and carried my mail inside. The album still sat on the cabinet. I opened it, running my hand across Richard's photograph, steady as ever. He would have chuckled at the arrogance of people who thought lineage defined worth. He used to say, "Reputation is a wall others lean against when storms come. Build it with care." That wall was holding now. The storm wasn't mine. It was Andrew's. And yet, my name and Clara's were the ones they speculated over. The local paper picked it up next, a short piece tucked between business updates and charity announcements. Prominent Whitmore wedding faces, unusual venue troubles. The reporter framed it carefully, but the subtext was clear. Questions lingered about whether both families were truly aligned. Clara called that night, her voice thin. "Mom, it's everywhere. People are saying we've been blacklisted. Andrew's family is furious. His mother keeps hinting that maybe this wouldn't be happening if we were from a different background." Her words broke, on the last syllable. I listened, my hands wrapped around the chipped teacup. "And what do you think, Clara?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched, heavy with her doubt. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know anymore." After we hung up, I sat in the dim light of the living room. The gossip swirled like wind outside the windows, trying to seep through cracks. But inside, I was steady. I had lived long enough to know how quickly people turn talk into judgment. They didn't need truth. They needed a story that made sense in their narrow frame. Let them talk, I thought. Their whispers were only smoke. The fire, Andrew's secrets, was still waiting to be seen. I laid the album open to a picture of Clara in her cap and gown, Richard's arm around her shoulders. I remembered that day, the way her eyes had shone with pride. That pride was still in her, buried under the weight of Andrew's world. Someday soon, it would rise again. For now, I stayed silent. Not because I was weak, but because silence has a way of sharpening truth. The gossipers thought they were exposing shame. They didn't realize they were only setting the stage. I folded the mail, blew out the lamp, and let the house rest in darkness. Tomorrow would bring louder whispers, but I was already preparing for the louder truth that would follow. The whispers outside my door were sharp, but the truth I carried was sharper. It had come to me quietly, in a place no one expected, in the back office of a neighborhood bank where I'd once brought my fourth graders for a career day tour. The manager then had been a young teller named Susan Whitaker. Shy, careful with numbers, more careful with people. I had taught her younger brother years before, and when she struggled with exams, I tutored her after hours in the library. She never forgot. Last month, I ran into her again by chance. We were both waiting at the dry cleaners. Her hair was threaded with gray now, but her eyes lit with recognition. "Mrs. Hale? I never thought I'd see you here." We talked about her children, about how she had risen through the bank, about the small town things people share when time bends them back together. Before she left, she lowered her voice. "Do you know an Andrew Whitmore?" I felt my chest tighten. "Yes. He's engaged to my daughter." Her mouth pressed into a line. "Be careful." I can't say much, but there are irregularities. He's been moving funds strangely, shifting accounts, masking debts. Nothing official yet, but enough to raise eyebrows. She hesitated, then added, "I'm only telling you because you once told me I was worth saving when I thought I'd fail out of college. You gave me courage. Consider this my way of returning it." Her words clung to me long after we parted. That was the first thread. I pulled at it carefully. Later, another old acquaintance, a former student's father who worked in compliance, confirmed the whispers. Gambling debts, loans tucked under shell companies, a man living shinier than his balance sheet could bear. And then I understood. Andrew's urgency wasn't about Clara. It was about lifelines. He didn't want a wife. He wanted a bridge into stability, into credibility, into a family that had quietly earned a reputation he could drape over his own cracks. He thought marrying Clara would plug the holes he had drilled himself. I sat with that truth alone in my living room, the teacup warm in my hands, the album open on the table. Richard's eyes looked back at me, steady as if to say, "You see it now. Act when you must." For weeks I held it like a stone in my pocket, heavy but hidden. Clara's laughter on the phone, her bright descriptions of gowns and flowers made it harder. How do you tell your daughter that the man she loves does not love her back, only the doors she might open? Still, I could not ignore it. Every glance Andrew gave me carried that hunger, not for acceptance, but for access. When he dismissed my friends, my history, my very worth, it wasn't arrogance alone. It was desperation dressed as superiority. He needed to keep her tethered, to blind her with chandeliers before she noticed the floor crumbling beneath him. No one else saw it. Not the gossiping women at the market, not the reporters, not even Clara. At least not yet. They all thought the cancellations were humiliation, bad luck, petty sabotage. They whispered that maybe we weren't refined enough. But I knew the unspoken truth. Andrew Whitmore was drowning, and he meant to use my daughter as his raft. That night I sat long in the silence, every tick of the mantel clock measuring my resolve. Protecting Clara did not mean shielding her from pain. It meant giving her the chance to see clearly, even if what she saw broke her. I whispered into the room, though no one was there but Richard's picture. He doesn't love her. He loves the doors she carries. The words settled, heavy and final. And in that stillness, I felt the shift again. The slow turn from endurance to action. The kind of action that does not roar, but reshapes the ground beneath a man who thought it would always hold. The calendar moved forward, stubborn as ever, until the date circled in gold ink was only days away. The invitations had already been sent, the caterers booked, the florists waiting. But there was one problem no ribbon could hide. There was no place left to hold the Whitmore wedding. Each morning brought another polite refusal. Venues that had once welcomed Andrew's calls now closed their doors, citing unexpected circumstances or scheduling conflicts. Behind their careful words was the same truth. They had chosen not to host him. Clara called me often in those days. At first, her voice was frantic, clinging to hope. "Mom, maybe we can set up a tent on the Whitmore estate. Maybe it will still be beautiful." But hope thinned quickly. By the final week, her words came in fragments, weary and trembling. On the eve of what was supposed to be the rehearsal dinner, I heard her tears through the receiver. Andrew's losing control. He's snapping at everyone. His mother, the planners, even me. He says this is all a conspiracy, that someone's determined to humiliate him. He keeps pacing, shouting, demanding we try harder, call more places. But there are no places left. Her voice faltered. "He looked at me tonight, Mom, and said if I really loved him, I would fix this. As if it's my fault the walls are closing in." I held the phone tighter, feeling her pain press through the line. "And what did you say?" I asked. "I said I've done everything I can," she whispered. But he only glared at me, like I'd betrayed him. Like I was the reason the doors are locked. I could picture the scene clearly. Andrew, face red with frustration, fists clenched, his polished image slipping away. Clara, small in his shadow, trying to hold together something that was never truly whole. That night, as she hung up, I knew the unraveling was nearly complete. The next day brought confirmation. Clara stopped by my house unannounced, her eyes rimmed with red. She collapsed into the old armchair and stared at the album still open on the table. "Mom," she whispered. I saw it. I waited. I saw who he really is. When the venues canceled, when the plans crumbled, he didn't hold me close. He didn't say we'd get through it together. He shouted. He blamed. He told me I was a liability, that marrying me was starting to feel like a mistake. Her words cracked something inside me, though I had already known. She pressed her hands to her face. All this time, I thought he loved me. But he doesn't. He loves what I represented, an image, a bridge, maybe even a way out of whatever mess he's hiding. When that fell apart, so did his affection. I reached over, placing my hand on hers. "Clara," I said softly, "real love doesn't vanish when circumstances change. It doesn't point fingers when storms arrive. It steadies you. It makes you feel seen, not small." She looked at me through tears, and for the first time in months, I saw clarity in her eyes. A painful clarity, yes, but clarity nonetheless. The grand Whitmore wedding was gone, dismantled not by coincidence, but by consequence. Andrew had built his vision on borrowed ground, and when that ground gave way, so did the illusion of love. The twist wasn't in the cancellations. It was in the realization that my daughter finally saw the truth I had carried quietly all along. The wedding hadn't just lost its venue, it had lost its meaning. Clara sat in my living room until the sun set, her head resting against the back of the chair, her shoulders heavy but freer somehow. I poured her tea in the chipped cup, the same one that had witnessed every turn of this story. She wrapped her hands around it, not caring about the crack along its rim. And in that quiet, I knew something had shifted. The wedding might have been broken, but perhaps my daughter had been mended in a way she hadn't expected. The confrontation came not in a ballroom or a church, but in the quiet lobby of the hotel where Andrew had tried to salvage a rehearsal dinner. I had gone there to collect Clara's things, fragile pieces of a dream that had already shattered. But he was waiting. He stood near the glass doors, his suit rumpled for the first time since I had met him, his hair unkempt as if even vanity had abandoned him. The moment his eyes found me, his face twisted. "You," he spat, striding forward, voice rising in the empty space. "You ruined everything." The words ricocheted against the marble, sharp, jagged. He looked taller in his anger, shoulders squared, fists clenched. For months I had been invisible to him, a shadow in his grand design. But now his gaze burned directly into me, furious, desperate. I let him stand there, his chest heaving, his polished shoes squeaking against the floor. And then, in a voice calm as still water, I answered, "No, Andrew. I reminded you that not everything can be bought." The air shifted. He blinked, as though the words carried a weight he hadn't expected. His mouth opened, then closed again, his fury stalling against the steadiness of my tone. "You think this makes you noble?" He sneered finally, though the edges of his voice trembled. "You embarrassed my family. You embarrassed Clara. I protected Clara," I interrupted, still quiet but unyielding. "From the truth you hid, from the debts you hoped to bury under her name. You didn't want a wife, Andrew. You wanted a shield." His eyes flickered, a flash of fear breaking through the mask. That small crack told me everything. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, but his voice was thinner now. I stepped closer, the album I had carried pressed against my side. "I know enough. I know about the loans, the shifting accounts, the life you can't afford but parade like a crown. And I know that you thought marrying my daughter would buy you time. The silence that followed was heavier than his shouting. He swallowed, the sound loud in the stillness, his bravado collapsing by inches. "You don't understand," he muttered, almost to himself. "This was supposed to fix everything. The Whitmore name, the Hale loyalty, it would have worked for you," I corrected. "Never for her." His shoulders slumped slightly, but anger flared again, desperate to survive. "You think people will thank you? You think anyone cares what a retired schoolteacher has to say? You're nothing compared to my family's influence." I drew a breath, steady and deep, then lifted my chin. "I don't need their thanks. I don't need influence. I have something you'll never own. Respect, freely given. You dismissed me as unimportant, yet it was my voice, not yours, that closed every door you thought belonged to you." That was the pivot. His face drained of color, the realization dawning in his eyes. He had spent his life believing power was loud, visible, stamped with crests and signatures. But here, in the quiet weight of my words, he saw a different kind of power, the kind he could never purchase. The lobby felt colder, though neither of us moved. Finally, he whispered, "You'll regret this." "No," I said, my voice like the final page of a book. The only regret would have been staying silent. For a long moment, he stared at me, his jaw working, his hands twitching as if searching for something to hold. But there was nothing left. Not the venues, not the image, not Clara's trust. He had lost all of it, undone by the very woman he thought didn't matter. When he finally turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps was hollow. I watched until the doors closed behind him, the glass reflecting only me. I stood alone in that lobby, not triumphant, not gloating, simply steady. The reversal was complete. The man who had once smirked at my chipped teacup, who had reduced my life's work to "she used to teach," had finally learned that some lessons arrive too late, but arrive all the same. The next evening, Clara arrived at my house carrying nothing but her handbag and a silence that spoke louder than any introduction. Her eyes were red but clear, her shoulders slumped yet lighter than I had seen in weeks. She sat at the old oak table, where the chipped teacup waited as if it had been saving her place. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she opened her hand, and there it was, the engagement ring Andrew had given her. A gleaming circle that had once dazzled her now looked heavy, like a shackle disguised as jewelry. She placed it on the table between us, the metal clinking softly against the wood. "I told him it was over," she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. "He tried to argue, tried to tell me I was being manipulated. But when I slid this off my finger, he stopped. He just stopped, like the air had been knocked out of him." Her words painted the scene, but I could see it even more vividly than she described. Andrew, standing tall one last time, only to watch the symbol of his illusion slip away, the light catching on the diamond as it left her hand, the silence filling the room after her sigh. Slow down at the pivot. That was the moment everything shifted. Not with shouting, not with lawyers, not with threats, but with a quiet breath and the removal of a ring. Clara's eyes glistened as she continued. "He sank into the chair, Mom." His face crumpled. For the first time, I realized all that anger was just fear. He wasn't losing me. He was losing the cover I gave him, the doors I opened. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't love. It never had. Then I reached across the table, my hand covering hers. She gripped me tightly, as if she had been waiting months to feel the ground under her feet again. "I forgot, Mom," she whispered, leaning closer, her voice trembling with both grief and relief. I forgot you've always been the important one. Tears stung my eyes, though I had promised myself I wouldn't cry. Important. For so long I had been told, by Andrew, by neighbors, even by Clara's distracted choices, that I was invisible, outdated, small. But here was my daughter, returning not just the ring, but the recognition I had thought was lost. I brushed her hair back from her face, the same way I had when she was a child waking from bad dreams. You didn't forget, Clara. You just had to remember in your own time she fell into my arms then, holding me as tightly as she once had when storms rattled the windows of our old house. Her sobs were no longer despairing, but cleansing. They carried away the illusion, the false promises, the chains of a man who mistook control for love. In that embrace, I felt the healing begin. Not just for her, but for me. All the sacrifices, the nights grading papers long after she slept, the years of putting myself second, it all surfaced in that moment, not as regret but as proof. Proof that love given quietly, faithfully, without condition, still mattered. The ring lay abandoned on the table, catching the last light of dusk. Once, it had been the centerpiece of a dream. Now it was just metal and stone, powerless without the hope she had poured into it. I lifted the chipped teacup, sipped the lukewarm tea, and felt something close to peace. Not triumph, not victory. Just the stillness of knowing the truth had finally spoken for itself. Clara pulled back, wiping her tears, her face flushed, but resolute. I don't know what comes next, she admitted. You don't need to, I said gently. Next will come. And when it does, you'll be standing tall, not shrinking to fit someone else's mold. She nodded, her lips trembling into a small, weary smile. Outside, the evening settled into quiet. Inside, the air felt lighter. The chapter with Andrew had ended, not with fireworks or scandal, but with a sigh, a ring placed back on the table, and a daughter returning to her mother's arms. And in that simplicity, everything had changed. The house felt different the day Clara moved back in. Not louder, not chaotic, just full in a way it hadn't been for years. Her suitcase sat by the doorway, half unzipped, clothes spilling out like she'd been too tired to finish. I didn't mind. It felt like the mess of life returning. We carried her things upstairs together, not speaking much. She paused outside her old room, running her fingers across the doorframe, tracing the faint pencil marks still etched there from when I measured her height year after year. She smiled through her tears. You never painted over. Some things aren't meant to be covered, I said. Later, we sat at the kitchen table, the one Richard built by hand before Clara was even born. The wood bore scratches from decades of meals and homework and late-night talks. Between us sat the chipped teacup, refilled with fresh tea, and the family album, waiting like a witness. Clara reached for the album first. She opened it carefully, her fingers slowing on a page near the middle. Look, she whispered. It was her at 6 years old, wearing a crooked crown from a school play, her gap-toothed smile wide and fearless. I sat beside her, remembering the way she had twirled around the living room that night, certain she was the brightest star on stage. She brushed her hand across the photograph, as if trying to touch that little girl again. I don't know when I lost her, Mom. Somewhere along the way, I traded her laughter for someone else's approval. You didn't lose her, I said gently. She was waiting. You just forgot to listen. We sat in silence for a while, sipping tea, the evening light spilling across the table. The chipped rim of the cup caught the glow, turning imperfection into something almost holy. I thought of all the moments it had witnessed, arguments, celebrations, quiet nights alone, and how it had survived, sturdy in its own flawed way. Clara closed the album, her eyes damp but steady. I thought Andrew was the important one, she admitted, with his family name, his promises, his world that seemed so shiny. But it was empty. It collapsed the moment the truth came out. I reached across, covering her hand with mine. Important people, I said slowly, each word deliberate, aren't on a list. They're the ones who stayed when no one else did. Her lips trembled into a smile, small but real. You've always stayed, Mom. Even when I didn't see it, I nodded, feeling the weight of years settle and then lift. That's what mothers do. We stay. And when you're ready, we remind you who you are. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, carrying the faint scent of autumn. Inside, there was only quiet, the kind that heals instead of haunts. We finished our tea in silence, the kind of silence that no longer needed to prove anything. Clara leaned her head against my shoulder, just as she had when she was a child, and I felt the circle complete itself. There was no wedding to prepare for, no guest list to argue over, no spectacle to uphold. There was only us, mother and daughter, two women who had walked through betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. Life didn't return to what it had been before. It never does. Instead, it unfolded into something new, quieter, and in its own way, stronger. A month after the wedding that never was, I found myself standing in a small classroom at the community center. The chalkboard was old, the desks mismatched, but the eyes looking back at me were the same kind I'd seen for decades, hungry to learn, desperate for someone to believe they could. I volunteered twice a week, helping children with reading, guiding young women through resumes, sometimes just listening to the tired sighs of those trying to start again. Each time I picked up the chalk, I felt Richard beside me, proud. Teaching had always been my calling. Stepping back into it, not for a paycheck, but for purpose, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself Andrew had tried to erase with one careless phrase. Only important people. Yes. And these children, these women, they were important. Every single one. Clara, too, found her own way forward. She came into the kitchen one morning with papers scattered in her arms, her face lit with determination. "I'm starting something," she said. "A non-profit for women who were deceived financially in marriage or engagement, women who signed papers they didn't understand, women who lost more than money. They lost years of their lives." Her voice trembled with passion. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I almost did." I looked at her then, not as my child, but as a woman, strong, scarred, but standing tall. "That's good work, Clara." "That's healing work." She smiled, her eyes brighter than they'd been in months. Maybe I had to lose something to understand how to give back. Our days settled into rhythm. Morning tea at the oak table. Afternoons apart, each of us building something new. Evenings together, sharing stories, laughter, sometimes quiet tears. The chipped teacup stayed in its place, a small reminder that broken things can still hold what sustains us. The album, too, found a new purpose. We opened it less to mourn and more to celebrate, to remember who we were and who we had become. Clara would linger on her childhood photos, then close the book with a sigh, saying, "That little girl deserved better." And now she's getting it. I often wondered about Andrew, about whether he learned anything from the collapse, but I realized it no longer mattered. My story was not about his downfall. It was about our rising, quiet, steady, undeniable. Justice didn't roar, it whispered. It whispered in the loyalty of old friends who closed doors on my behalf. It whispered in Clara's trembling hand as she set down the ring. It whispered in my own voice when I finally said aloud that not everything can be bought. And now, it whispers here. to you. I have told you my story not to ask for pity, but to share a truth I had to learn the hardest way. Importance isn't granted by others. It's lived. It's remembered. It's the legacy of kindness, respect, and resilience. Perhaps you've been made to feel small, dismissed, told you weren't enough. Perhaps someone once said only important people belong, and you believed them. But I am here, with my chipped teacup and my daughter by my side, to tell you that you are already important. Not because of titles or wealth, or who lets you into their glittering halls, but because of who you are when no one is looking. So I'll leave you with this. Do you think I was wrong to do what I did? To step quietly into the storm and remind Andrew Whitmore that influence without integrity collapses? If you've ever been told you weren't important enough, share your story. Tell me where you're listening from, because maybe the most important thing of all is this: none of us are invisible when we choose to stand.